So what I want to do next is just spend a little bit of time on just war theory as seen through the eyes of John Howard Yoder in that chapter on just war. He starts out with the early church and he asks, did it allow for military service? And his answer certainly was that it did not. Okay. However, that's not exactly necessarily completely accurate, as we'll see in a second. He does point out that the early church struggled with service under Roman power, and that might have made for some of the very anti-military service statements. But at the same time, he ends up concluding that the presence of Christians in the military was no more acceptable to the church than their participation in adultery and idolatry. All three were recognized and denounced by the fathers, the church fathers. However, as I said, the early church fathers were not as unified on the issue of pacifism as Yoder seems to have thought. In this note from First Things, we find that both Origen and Tertullian had some mixture, some complication, and were not absolutists on the issue of military service and whether Christians could legitimately serve in the military. Okay, so why just war? Well, just so that we don't lose the thread here, I'm examining just war, partly because it's interesting, yes, but mainly because it is a third option. And it's the option that the church tried to take until it couldn't anymore, until it basically fell apart. It still advocates it, but there's not much at this point in time. Not too many people are giving this an ear in practice. In thought, it certainly is still being extolled, okay? It is a sort of compromise path, all right? And this is why Christian anarchists generally don't like just war doctrine, because it's a compromise path that attempts to influence the outcomes of the state, especially in matters of war, without either becoming subservient to the state or becoming, completely detached, which seems to be kind of a strange kind of complicity with what the state is doing. So starting with Augustine, at least, we start to get clear arguments for regrettably having to use or justifying violence, especially in the case of defense. That seems to be a constant throughout just war. The one most clear case in which war is justified is in defense of your people. And just war doctrine developed slowly as an attempt to control violence. In the Middle Ages, the church developed it partly to kind of get under control some of these rather like loose cannons of the early medieval period, marauding, but also later on with more developed principalities and political systems. It was necessary for the church to kind of try to intervene and to create standards for Christians to limit the violence. Regrettably, holy wars and crusades were early justified as God's will. But in the 13th century with Aquinas, we get this full jus ad bellum, okay, or justice of war arguments. And here we see the compromises. For instance, in order for a war to be just, it needs to be done with the right intentions. And this includes loving our enemies and desiring peace. And what this boils down to in practice would be a sort of examination on the part of a sovereign. Am I doing this because I love my enemies and want to stop this war? Can I love my enemies and try to fight them and kill them at the same time? It seems difficult to imagine in practice, right? And so this seems like a compromise, right? If we say that we inwardly love our enemies, but we're not necessarily doing anything externally. Although the doctrine does say, in order for war to be just, you have to be trying to make peace. You can't just desire it in your heart. You have to also show evidence that you're trying to negotiate. You're not taking an absolute stand towards victory. Right authority becomes the legitimate political power in just war doctrine, duly promulgated or selected political power with that holds force in a particular area. And the war has to have a just cause, which is generally defense, but as just war thought was developed, it could become also intervention, preemption. Different thinkers added other scenarios, humanitarian intervention, and so forth. Holy war dropped out as we moved into the early modern period. Also developed over time in civil law was jus in bello, or the different justice in the strategy and tactics of war. So jus in bello covers certain strategies as well as weaponry, and includes things like discriminating between combatants and non-combatants. Only combatants ought to be considered enemies in war, and non-combatants should be excluded. But that's difficult in practice, and so the solution in just war theory became the doctrine of the double effect, right? In which collateral damage, that is, when innocent civilians and non-combatants are struck at the same time as combatants, as long as the intention was not to kill the non-combatants, it is a double effect, right? A secondary effect that does not make the strategy or the tactic unjust, okay? Weapons of mass destruction are precluded, though, in this way of thinking, because they cannot be limited, right? They imply a lack of ability to limit their destruction. Also, in jus in bello is the principle of proportionality of force, that you cannot wield, excessive force to try to stop an attack. A good example of this would be everything's controversial, but like the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II, with the only time that we've used nuclear weapons. Okay, and starting in the early modern period, this entire just war corpus starts to emerge in international law to influence diplomacy and international negotiations. But at about the same time that it did that, it also got disregarded more and more. Okay? So as I said, the tradition is still with us, but it has become harder and harder, partly due to just the level of weaponry that we have, to in any serious way comply with it. Nevertheless, just war doctrine represents a middle path in which the Christian church can engage with worldly power politics without either succumbing to political power, i.e. being its tool, or advocating for violence in the name of religious truth, holy war, okay? So just war doctrine attempts to influence rather than control or comply or ignore worldly power. And as I said, this is a third way, it's a compromise. You get that yucky feeling with some of these compromises. And yet, people who develop the just war doctrine, you could argue, have the boldness to wade into that morally impure territory to try to find some way to mitigate the destruction, with the assumption that it cannot be completely stopped. See, this is where, say, Ballou would say, but we can stop it because so many of us are Christians and we just need to, start acting like them and also be rational, and we'll form communities and we'll just stop this political juggernaut of the state from doing its damage. And so we don't need to make these moral compromises, okay? There's little evidence that past a certain number of people, at any point in time, has there been enough people truly devoted to that way of life. I think this is the greatest indictment of not the teachings of Christ, but of Christians. the greatest indictment of Christians is that our history has been dotted by these small little pinpoints of light. Eugene McCaraher's book, The Enchantments of Mammon, treats them like that. There's these little points of light throughout Christian history where the curtain is opened and you see this attempt on earth to develop really the city of God, right? And it works for a while, and then the curtain closes again because it's just so hard. And there never seems to be like a widespread attempt, or like Calvin's Geneva, if there is a widespread attempt, it goes horribly wrong at a certain point, okay? And if that's the case, then, and this is what Yoder ends up doing, even though he takes the sort of classic Mennonite position on violence, and nonviolence is his way. But yet, in examining just war, he can't help but say, but it's a respectable position. It's a respectable position, partly because the alternatives are so remote that we can't hardly imagine them. And so it's not an illegitimate position. That seems to be his conclusion. Let's see if I can get my mouse back here. There we go. Nope, wrong way. I saw it. Don't you hate it when that happens? Okay, well, I skipped over that one, but I want to get it back. There we go. I guess this is my conclusion. The complete detachment option of Christian anarchism has real moral and practical problems, despite the fact that I'm attracted to it. And that means that, it's something that has to be contemplated further, because there's a difference between what is good in theory and what works in practice. And we know that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to be absolutely consistent, whether it's when we ask what should we do if we're in a position to stop a school shooter. Last time we talked about this, and I don't know where you guys stand, but I was pretty forthright in saying if I had a chance down there in Uvalde to stop that school shooter, I would have, even if it meant that I had to kill him because he was killing so many children. I would feel morally bound to do so. Same thing with the Nazis. What does a Christian do in the face of a power that evil? And again, with the examples of Yoder, or the pedophile priests and other clergy, I don't want to just single out the Catholic Church. It seems to be a general problem that has happened across denominations. But when we're faced with something like that kind of personal behavior, do we remonstrate with them and that's it? And then let them go on their way to molest more children or grope more women? Or do we call the authorities and therefore cooperate with them, as distasteful as that might be? Okay. So my conclusion is that the position of complete detachment from worldly power is only defensible if most of Christians' time is spent building up another worldly polity to replace the state in the hearts and practices of others. In other words, I'm not asking for people to choose. Well, what I'm saying is, if you want to say that the correct path is complete detachment or complete inaction towards the state, then you had better be spending most of that time that you would have spent stopping the state in building up that other worldly polity of the church. And if you're not willing to do that, then at the very least, you should stop talking, which is always a good option, I believe. If not, to change your mind about what to do in situations like this. Okay. Otherwise, the strict position of complete detachment is morally dubious, and the just war position, sort of writ large, the compromise in which the church attempts to moderate the state and interact with it appropriately, is worthy of consideration. Again, I say this not because I like it, but because it seems like I really don't have a choice. It makes sense to me.